November 23, 1942, just after 4 in the afternoon, near the frozen village of Savitsky, west of Stalingrad. Snow drifted across the open steppe and gathered against the tracks of Soviet tanks. From the north came armored vehicles of the 4th Tank Corps. From the south came machines of the 4th Mechanized Corps. Their crews saw one another through the gray winter haze, raised signal flags, and fired green flares into the sky. The two arms of the giant trap had met. Far to the east, between the Don and Volga rivers, nearly 300,000 German and Allied soldiers were suddenly cut off from the outside world. Many of them did not yet know it. Some were still attacking ruined factories inside Stalingrad. Others were holding thin lines across empty fields. But the roads behind them had been severed, their fuel was running out, and Soviet armor was already turning inward. At the headquarters of the German 6th Army, General Friedrich Paulus faced a decision that could no longer be postponed. Reports arrived from every direction. Romanian formations on the flanks had collapsed. Soviet tanks had crossed the Don. Supply columns had been overrun. Telephone lines were dead. Units that had existed on the map that morning had disappeared by evening. Paulus sent a warning upward. His army, he reported, was threatened with destruction. Ammunition and fuel were nearly exhausted. To survive, the 6th Army would have to abandon Stalingrad and break out toward the southwest. The message reached Adolf Hitler. The danger was clear. The window for escape was still open, but it was closing by the hour. Hitler refused. The 6th Army would remain at Stalingrad. It would form a fortress. It would wait for rescue. That order transformed an operational crisis into one of the greatest military disasters in history. Friedrich Paulus was 52 years old, tall, controlled, and more comfortable with maps than with chaos. He had spent much of his career as a staff officer, studying plans, organizing movements, and turning broad instructions into precise orders. In January 1942, he had taken command of the 6th Army, one of the strongest formations in the German military. It was a remarkable appointment for a man with limited experience commanding large formations in battle. Paulus had served in important headquarters positions, but he had never commanded a division or an army corps. Yet he was intelligent, methodical, and respected as a planner. In May 1942, his army helped destroy a major Soviet offensive near Kharkov. Hundreds of Soviet tanks were lost, and enormous numbers of Red Army soldiers were captured. The victory strengthened German confidence. It also helped convince Hitler that the Soviet Union was close to collapse. But the Soviet Union was not collapsing. It was learning. The German summer offensive of 1942, known as Case Blue, began with a strategic promise and a fatal contradiction. Hitler wanted the oil fields of the Caucasus because Germany's war machine depended on fuel. He also wanted Stalingrad, an industrial city on the Volga that carried Joseph Stalin's name. Controlling the Volga would disrupt an important Soviet transport route. Capturing Stalingrad could help protect the northern flank of the German advance toward the Caucasus. And taking the city named after Stalin would carry enormous symbolic value. The objectives appeared connected on a map, but in reality, they pulled German strength in different directions. Army Group South was divided. One part moved hundreds of kilometers into the Caucasus. Another drove east towards Stalingrad. The farther these armies advanced, the longer their supply lines became. Trucks broke down. Fuel had to travel across vast distances. Railway lines had to be repaired before they could carry German equipment. More importantly, there were fewer reserves available to protect the growing gaps between the advancing formations. Paulus's 6th Army received responsibility for taking Stalingrad. By August, it had crossed vast stretches of steppe and was approaching the Volga. On August 23, 1942, German bombers struck the city in repeated waves. Fire spread through workers' districts. Oil burned along the river. Buildings collapsed into streets. Thousands of civilians were killed, injured, or driven into cellars. German panzer units reached the Volga north of the city, and for a moment, it appeared that Stalingrad might fall quickly. But the bombing had created a battlefield that favored the defender. Rubble blocked tanks. Cellars became bunkers. Broken factories became fortresses. Every wall could conceal a rifleman. Every sewer could become an infiltration route. The ruins prevented the Germans from using their speed, mobility, and coordination as effectively as they had in the open countryside. The Soviet 62nd Army, commanded by General Vasily Chukov, clung to a narrow strip along the western bank of the Volga. Its soldiers fought from the grain elevator, railway stations, apartment buildings, and the enormous factory district in the north. Chukov ordered his men to remain extremely close to the Germans, sometimes only a grenade throw away. This reduced the effectiveness of German artillery and aircraft. Bombing Soviet positions risked hitting German soldiers occupying the next building, room, or floor. The battle became a contest between small groups of exhausted men. A staircase could change hands several times during one night. Germans might control the upper floors of a building, while Soviet soldiers remained in the basement. Assault teams moved through holes blasted in walls. Snipers waited among bricks and twisted steel. Men learned to identify danger by sound. The scrape of a boot in rubble, the click of a rifle bolt, the whistle of an incoming shell, or the sudden silence before an attack. The Sixth Army advanced, but every game cost time, ammunition, fuel, and trained soldiers. By October, German troops controlled most of Stalingrad, yet they had not destroyed its defenders. Soviet footholds beside the Volga were sometimes only a few hundred meters deep, but they remain alive. Barges crossed the river at night under artillery fire, bringing fresh troops, ammunition, and food. The same boats carried wounded soldiers back to the eastern bank. German officers looked at their maps and saw a city that was almost captured. Soviet commanders looked beyond the city and saw something very different. They saw a German army being drawn deeper into a trap. The greatest danger did not lie inside Stalingrad. It lay on the open flanks. To concentrate German divisions in the city, the long northern and southern approaches were guarded largely by Romanian forces, supported farther west by Italian and Hungarian armies. These Allied troops were not the cowards described in many post-war German accounts. Numerous Romanian units fought stubbornly, but courage could not compensate for inadequate equipment. They were spread across enormous distances. They lacked enough modern anti-tank guns, armored reserves, mines, transport vehicles, winter clothing, and reliable communications. Some Romanian divisions were responsible for fronts more than 20 kilometers wide. Against a limited infantry attack, such a line might survive. Against massed Soviet armor, it was dangerously thin. German intelligence detected signs of an enemy buildup. Soviet railway traffic increased. Prisoners spoke of tanks assembling beyond the Don. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed new bridges, roads, and supply areas. Romanian commanders repeatedly warned that their sectors were vulnerable. General Petre Dumitrescu, commanding the Romanian Third Army north of Stalingrad, requested stronger anti-tank defenses. He also wanted permission to eliminate Soviet bridgeheads across the Don before they could be used for a major offensive. The warnings produced little action. German reserves remained tied to the fighting inside Stalingrad. Hitler continued to focus on the last Soviet positions near the Volga. The city appeared to be only one final assault away from falling. That illusion became more powerful than the evidence gathering on the flanks. Meanwhile, the Soviet High Command prepared Operation Uranus. The plan was simple in concept and enormous in scale. Instead of attacking the strongest German positions inside Stalingrad, the Red Army would strike the weaker Axis armies far to the north and south. Powerful tank and mechanized formations would break through, move rapidly into the German rear, seize crossings over the Don, and meet west of the city. The Sixth Army would not be pushed out of Stalingrad. It would be locked inside it. The Soviets concealed their preparations through camouflage, deceptive radio transmissions, night marches, and strict control of movement. More than 1 million troops were assembled across the wider Stalingrad region, supported by thousands of guns, tanks, mortars, and aircraft. Not all would attack simultaneously, but the concentration was far greater than German intelligence believed possible. Many German officers expected a Soviet offensive. The failure was not that they saw nothing. The failure was that they misunderstood what they saw. Senior commanders believed the Red Army lacked the strength for more than one major winter operation. Some assumed the main Soviet blow would fall around Moscow. Others believed any attack near Stalingrad would be a limited attempt to relieve the city. They underestimated Soviet reserves and overestimated the damage already inflicted on the Red Army. At 7:20 in the morning on November 19, 1942, Soviet artillery opened fire north of Stalingrad. Fog, snow, and freezing mist reduced visibility, but the barrage rolled across Romanian positions with crushing force. Thousands of guns, mortars, and rocket launchers struck trenches, command posts, artillery batteries, and telephone exchanges. The earth shook. Men could not hear commands. Communication wires were cut faster than they could be repaired. Officers lost contact with neighboring units. Smoke and fog concealed the approaching Soviet infantry. Then the tanks appeared. Romanian soldiers destroyed some of the first vehicles and held several strongpoints. But the offensive was too wide, too deep, and too powerful. Many Romanian anti-tank guns could not penetrate the frontal armor of heavier Soviet tanks. Once the defensive line cracked, Soviet mobile corps drove through the gaps. They did not stop to destroy every pocket of resistance. They moved into the rear, overrunning headquarters, road junctions, supply depots, artillery parks, and airfields. The Romanian Third Army began to break apart. Thousands of men were encircled. Others moved westward across the snow, leaving behind guns that had no tractors, horses, or ammunition. The next morning, November 20th, the southern arm of Operation Uranus struck the Romanian Fourth Army below Stalingrad. Bad weather delayed parts of the Soviet advance, but once it gained momentum, the result was much the same. Romanian defenses bent, split, and collapsed. German commanders attempted to form emergency battle groups from mechanics, engineers, headquarters personnel, anti-aircraft crews, and whatever tanks could be found. It was not enough. Soviet mechanized columns moved northwest toward Kalach, the vital bridge and supply center on the Don. Inside 6th Army headquarters, the map changed faster than Paulus's staff could understand it. Colored lines representing friendly units were erased or moved backward. Reports arrived late, contradicted one another, or stopped completely. Some commanders asked where they should retreat. Others asked whether retreat was permitted at all. Fuel trucks were trapped on the wrong side of Soviet spearheads. Ammunition trains burned beside railway tracks. Field hospitals that had been located safely behind the front suddenly found Soviet tanks approaching. The Army's rear area had become the battlefield. Paulus understood the immediate military logic. 6th Army had to stop attacking in Stalingrad, withdraw its divisions from the city, gather its remaining mobile forces, and break southwest before the Soviet ring became solid. But this was not a simple maneuver. The army was spread across a large area. Many divisions were locked in close combat. Thousands of horses, trucks, artillery pieces, wounded soldiers, and supply vehicles crowded the roads. Fuel was already scarce. A breakout would require abandoning heavy equipment. It might also mean leaving tens of thousands of wounded men behind. Most importantly, it would require Paulus to disobey Hitler's demand that Stalingrad be held. On November 21st, before the encirclement was complete, Hitler ordered the 6th Army to maintain its positions despite the danger of temporary isolation. He believed the Soviet attack could be contained. He also feared that abandoning Stalingrad would endanger the German armies still deep in the Caucasus. There was therefore a military concern behind his refusal, but it had become inseparable from pride, symbolism, and his increasing belief that withdrawal represented weakness. During the winter crisis outside Moscow in 1941, Hitler had issued orders forbidding large retreats. Some German formations had survived, and Hitler convinced himself that his personal determination had saved the entire Eastern Front. Now, he attempted to apply the same lesson to a completely different situation. The difference was supply. Outside Moscow, many German formations had remained connected to roads and railways. At Stalingrad, An entire army was about to be sealed inside a pocket more than 50 kilometers across. Once the ring closed, every loaf of bread, artillery shell, liter of fuel, medical bandage, and replacement soldier would have to arrive by air. On November 22nd, Paulus reported that his army was surrounded. He warned that fuel and ammunition were running out and that a breakout was unavoidable if the Sixth Army was to survive. General Maximilian von Wakes, commander of Army Group B, supported immediate withdrawal. General Kurt Zeitzler, chief of the German Army General Staff, also argued that the army must escape. The calculations were brutal but clear. The longer Sixth Army waited, the weaker it would become. The Soviet ring would grow thicker. Snow would deepen. Vehicles would consume their remaining fuel simply moving into position. A breakout that was dangerous on November 22nd might be impossible 1 week later. Hitler listened to the warnings. But he also listened to Hermann Göring. Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, claimed that his aircraft could supply the Sixth Army until a relief force arrived. Hitler wanted to believe him. Earlier in the war, German aircraft had helped sustain a surrounded force at Deminsk. That success now became a dangerously false comparison. The Deminsk pocket had contained far fewer soldiers. Stalingrad was farther from secure air bases. Winter weather was worse. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft defenses were stronger. The Luftwaffe's transport fleet was already strained by commitments across Europe, North Africa, and the Soviet Union. The Sixth Army estimated that it required roughly 600 tons of supplies each day under normal defensive conditions. Even 300 to 350 tons represented a desperate minimum that would provide only limited food, fuel, and ammunition. The airlift rarely came close. Across the siege, the average amount delivered each day was only a fraction of what the army needed. On some days, storms, fog, mechanical failure, or Soviet attacks prevented meaningful deliveries. Aircraft arrived carrying ammunition but insufficient food. Others carried food, but not enough fuel. Some cargoes contained equipment that had little immediate value. Ground crews unloaded transport planes while Soviet artillery struck the airfields. Every flight into the pocket risked an aircraft and trained crew that Germany could not easily replace. Yet on November 24th, Hitler made his decision final. The Sixth Army would stay. Stalingrad would be held as a fortress. Relief would come from outside. At first, many soldiers believed the promise. German armies had escaped dangerous situations before. Officers told their men that the encirclement was temporary. Propaganda described the pocket as a powerful defensive position. The word fortress suggested walls, stores, preparation, and strength. In reality, the Stalingrad pocket was a rough oval of frozen villages, open steppe, wrecked vehicles, and shattered city blocks. It contained hundreds of thousands of men, tens of thousands of horses, large numbers of wounded soldiers, and almost no stored food. Rations were reduced. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Fuel was preserved for tanks and essential vehicles, leaving trucks and ambulances motionless. Artillery batteries received strict limits on the number of shells they could fire. Mechanics removed parts from damaged vehicles to keep others running. Medical units reused bandages. Soldiers wrapped their feet in cloth when their boots fell apart. The destruction of the Sixth Army did not begin with a dramatic final attack. It began administratively. A smaller bread ration, one fewer artillery shell, a truck that could not move, a radio without working batteries, a wounded soldier who could not be evacuated. Command inside the pocket also began to harden. Paulus remained obedient, while his chief of staff, General Arthur Schmidt, strongly supported holding Stalingrad and waiting for relief. Other commanders disagreed. General Walther von Seydlitz-Schurzbach urged a breakout. He even allowed limited withdrawals in his sector, apparently hoping to force a larger decision. Paulus reversed the movement. He had warned Hitler, but he would not openly defy him. That distinction became fatal. A commander can understand the danger and still fail to act against the system that created it. Outside the pocket, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein received command of a new formation called Army Group Dawn. Manstein was one of Germany's most respected operational commanders. His task was to stabilize the broken front, protect the approaches to Rostov, and, somehow, rescue 6th Army. But he did not receive a fresh army built specifically for the mission. He had to collect formations arriving from other sectors, including the experienced 6th Panzer Division. The relief force was placed under General Hermann Hoth. On December 12th, Operation Winter Storm began from the Kotelnikovo area southwest of Stalingrad. German tanks broke through Soviet defenses and moved northward. For the men inside the pocket, distant artillery fire created hope. Rumors traveled faster than official orders. Some claimed the relief force was only 80 kilometers away, then 60, then 40. Soldiers looked toward the southwest and imagined German headlights appearing on the horizon. But distance on a map concealed the real problem. Hoth panzer divisions were advancing at the end of vulnerable supply routes. Soviet forces attacked their flanks. Bridges had to be captured. Frozen rivers had to be crossed. Tanks broke down. Supporting infantry fell behind. Every kilometer cost time, fuel, ammunition, and men. By December 19th, the German spearheads reached the Mishkova River, approximately 48 kilometers from the Stalingrad pocket. It was the closest they would ever come. 48 kilometers may not sound far. A healthy person could walk that distance in one long day. But the 6th Army was not a group of healthy men walking along an open road. It was a starving army with thousands of wounded soldiers, exhausted horses, frozen vehicles, limited fuel, and Soviet divisions surrounding it. To reach Hoth, Paulus would have to gather his troops without alerting the enemy, abandon much of Stalingrad, break through prepared Soviet positions, and continue moving while attacked from several directions. Manstein wanted the 6th Army to prepare Operation Thunderclap, the proposed breakout, but his instructions remained cautious and dependent upon Hitler's approval. Hitler would permit Paulus to move toward the relief force only if Stalingrad itself remained occupied. That was impossible. A real breakout required abandoning the city and using almost every mobile formation to force open a corridor. Hitler wanted both rescue and possession. He refused to choose between them. As a result, he made both impossible. On the 19th and the 20th of December, Paulus and Manstein discussed the situation. Paulus asked for clear authority. He explained that his tanks had fuel for only a limited distance and that preparations for a breakout would require several days. Manstein pressed the need for action, but he did not issue an unconditional order to abandon Stalingrad. Hitler still refused. The window narrowed again. Then the wider German front began to collapse. On December 16th, the Red Army launched Operation Little Saturn against the Italian 8th Army farther west. The offensive threatened the airfield supplying Stalingrad and the rear of Manstein's relief force. Soviet armor drove toward Tatsinskaya and Morozovsk. If Manstein continued north, his forces might be cut off. Worse, the route to Rostov could be lost while Army Group it was still withdrawing from the Caucasus. Attempting to rescue one army could place several others in danger. By December 23rd, Hoth spearheads were ordered to withdraw. Inside the pocket, soldiers understood what had happened before official messages arrived. The distant artillery became quieter. Aircraft crews brought no good news. The southwestern horizon remained empty. This was the moment when Hitler's decision became irreversible. In late November, a breakout would have been extremely dangerous and might have failed, but a substantial part of 6th Army could possibly have escaped. By late December, its soldiers were weaker, its vehicles had less fuel, the Soviet ring was stronger, and the relief force was retreating. The army had waited for a door that never opened until it no longer had the strength to reach it. Christmas came to Stalingrad in darkness and cold. Soldiers received tiny portions of bread and thin soup. Some units ate horse meat boiled without salt. Men wrote letters home that might never leave the pocket. Many avoided telling their families the full truth. Yet the truth appeared through small details: the hunger, the cold, the endless artillery fire, and the wish to see home one more time. In bunkers lit by candles, officers read holiday messages promising that Germany would not abandon them. Outside, Soviet loudspeakers played music and announced that the Sixth Army was doomed. The suffering was not limited to German soldiers. Romanian troops, trapped inside the pocket, endured the same hunger and exposure. Soviet prisoners and forced laborers held by the Germans received even less food and died in large numbers. Civilians who had survived the German bombing and months of street fighting hid in cellars among the ruins. They searched for water, firewood, and scraps of food. Stalingrad had become a place where military maps concealed thousands of private catastrophes. As December ended, the failure of the airlift became increasingly visible. Bad weather closed airfields. Soviet fighters intercepted transport formations. Anti-aircraft fire became more intense. The loss of German air bases outside the pocket forced the aircraft to travel greater distances. Transport planes landing at Potomnik carried food, fuel, ammunition, and mail. On their return journeys, they attempted to evacuate wounded soldiers. Crowds gathered near the runway. Each aircraft represented survival, but there were never enough seats. Doctors selected men considered most likely to recover. Those with severe injuries watched others being carried aboard. Discipline weakened. Soldiers stole food. Armed guards protected supply stores. A loaf of bread became more valuable than money, medals, or rank. Frostbite filled the medical stations. Lice spread through clothing. Dysentery, typhus, malnutrition, and exhaustion reduced men who had already survived months of combat. A soldier did not have to be shot to disappear from the Army's strength report. He could simply become too weak to stand. Paulus continued sending messages. He described the condition of his army and requested freedom to act. Zeitzler argued repeatedly with Hitler. To draw attention to the starvation inside the pocket, he reduced his own meals and lost a noticeable amount of weight. Hitler ordered him to stop. Facts themselves had begun to resemble disobedience. At Hitler's headquarters, the Sixth Army was increasingly viewed not as a formation that could be rescued, but as a force whose continued resistance might hold Soviet armies away from other parts of the front. There was some military logic behind that calculation. By remaining inside the pocket, the Sixth Army tied down major Soviet formations. Its resistance bought time for German forces to withdraw from the Caucasus and construct a new defensive position. But that was not the plan originally presented to the soldiers. They had been told that aircraft would supply them and that a relief force would rescue them. Now their destruction was being used to solve a wider strategic crisis. On January 8, 1943, Soviet officers offered surrender terms. They promised food, medical attention, and safety for prisoners. Paulus sent the proposal to Hitler. Hitler rejected it. The Sixth Army would continue fighting. 2 days later, on January 10th, the Red Army launched Operation Ring, the final offensive to destroy the pocket. Thousands of Soviet guns opened fire. The bombardment struck trenches, villages, command posts, airfields, and ruined buildings. Then Soviet infantry and tanks advanced from several directions. The starving defenders resisted with what remained, but the balance was overwhelming. Units that had once controlled kilometers of front were reduced to scattered groups. Artillery pieces fell silent when their ammunition was exhausted. Tanks became fixed bunkers after using their last fuel. Communications failed as command posts were overrun or forced to move. On January 16th, Potomnik Airfield was lost. The scene around it was one of panic and misery. Wounded soldiers crawled or were pulled on sledges toward Gumrak, the last major landing ground. Vehicles without fuel were abandoned along the icy road. Men attempted to climb onto overloaded trucks until guards forced them away. Aircraft took off under shell fire. Some crashed. With Potomnik gone, the air bridge was nearly broken. The pocket shrank rapidly. Soviet forces captured village after village and drove the Germans back toward the ruins of Stalingrad. On January 22nd, Gumrak was lost. After that, only occasional supply drops remained possible. Many containers landed inside Soviet positions. Others broke apart when they struck the frozen ground. Food spilled into snow. Ammunition boxes disappeared into deep drifts. The Sixth Army was no longer being supplied in any meaningful sense. Inside Stalingrad, the remaining soldiers occupied basements, factory halls, sewers, bunkers, and wrecked buildings. The army was divided into northern and southern groups. Commanders lost contact with units only a few streets away. Snow entered rooms without roofs. The dead could not be buried. Soldiers removed coats and boots from corpses because the living needed them. Doctors operated without anesthetic. There was little medicine and almost no food for patients. The difference between a soldier and a wounded man disappeared. Almost everyone was sick, injured, starving, or frozen. On January 24th, Paulus sent another desperate message. Further resistance, he warned, had become senseless. He requested permission to surrender. Hitler refused again. He praised the army's courage and demanded that it hold until the last possible moment. His orders now served almost no realistic operational purpose inside Stalingrad. The pocket could not be relieved. It could not carry out a breakout. It could barely communicate with the outside world. Its resistance might delay Soviet formation for a few more days, but the cost was measured in men dying by the hour. The language of duty had become a way to avoid responsibility. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, he promoted Paulus to field marshal. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. The message was unmistakable. Hitler expected Paulus to kill himself rather than surrender. Paulus understood the meaning and rejected it. He had obeyed Hitler when a breakout might still have saved part of his army, but he would not die simply to protect Hitler's legend. The next morning, January 31st, 1943, Soviet troops reached Paulus's headquarters in the basement of a Univermag department store in central Stalingrad. The rooms were dark, crowded, and filthy. Officers who had once commanded hundreds of thousands of men stood beside maps of a battle that no longer existed. Paulus did not conduct a dramatic formal surrender. Members of his staff handled the arrangements, and he allowed himself to be taken prisoner. In the north, General Karl Strecker's remaining forces continued fighting around the factory district. On February 2nd, they also surrendered. The battle ended not with a heroic final charge, but with exhausted men emerging from cellars and ruins, placing their weapons in piles, and beginning a march into captivity. The numbers reveal the scale, but they cannot fully describe it. Estimates differ according to who is counted and at which stage of encirclement, but roughly 250,000 to nearly 300,000 German and Allied personnel were trapped when the Soviet ring closed. Tens of thousands were eventually evacuated by air, mainly wounded soldiers and technical specialists. Large numbers died in combat, from hunger, disease, exposure, or untreated wounds. Approximately 91,000 exhausted survivors entered Soviet captivity at the end of the battle. Only a small fraction, roughly 5,000 or 6,000, eventually returned home years later. The Soviet victory also came at an enormous price. Red Army losses during the wider Stalingrad campaign reached into the hundreds of thousands killed, missing, and wounded. Civilians endured bombing, starvation, forced labor, execution, and the near-total destruction of their city. Stalingrad was not a clean or simple triumph. It was a victory created through extraordinary Soviet endurance, improved planning, enormous sacrifice, and the complete failure of Germany's strategy in the South. It is tempting to explain the catastrophe in one sentence. Hitler ignored Paulus's warning. That is true, but it is not the whole truth. Hitler's stand-fast order was decisive. Göring's impossible promise made the decision easier. Manstein's relief operation arrived too late and lacked sufficient strength. Paulus recognized the danger, but refused to break the chain of command. German intelligence underestimated Soviet power. German strategy attempted to capture the Caucasus and Stalingrad at the same time. The exposed flanks were entrusted to under-equipped Allied armies without adequate reserves, and the Red Army executed a bold encirclement with growing skill. The disaster was therefore not one mistake. It was a chain of warnings ignored because each warning threatened a belief Hitler refused to abandon. He believed Soviet reserves were nearly exhausted. He believed determination could replace fuel. He believed holding territory was always stronger than retreating. And he believed armies could be commanded to achieve what logistics had already made impossible. Stalingrad changed the war because it destroyed more than the Sixth Army. It destroyed the image of German invincibility. Across occupied Europe, people heard that an entire German army had surrendered. In the Soviet Union, the victory demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could be surrounded and annihilated. Germany and its allies could replace neither the experienced soldiers lost at Stalingrad nor the confidence that disappeared with them. From that winter onward, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front increasingly passed to the Red Army. For the soldiers inside the pocket, however, history's great turning point did not feel like armies moving across a map. It felt like an empty bowl, a frozen boot, a wounded friend who could not be evacuated, an aircraft that never arrived, and in order to hold a position that had already become a grave. Paulus had warned that the army faced destruction. Hitler answered with promises of air supply, relief, and victory through obedience. Nearly 300,000 men were trapped inside the consequences. Some died fighting, some froze, some starved, some vanished into captivity. And when the ruins finally became silent, Stalingrad left the world with a brutal lesson. An army may survive the power of its enemy, but it cannot survive forever when reality itself is forbidden to reach its leader. Hitler ignored the warning. The snow covered the roads. The Volga carried the smoke away, and an entire army paid the price.